Like everyone to do is, if you're eating or drinking, you don't have to close your eyes, but if not, I'd like you to close your eyes and think about a scientist and what you picture in your mind when you think of a scientist. So I'm going to give you a few seconds there to think about that. So maybe these were the first thoughts that came to your mind when you thought of a scientist. I'm just going to hold this. And if they weren't, awesome. If they were, don't feel bad, because when I typed scientist images into Google, this is exactly what came up. Does anyone notice anything about any of these pictures? Say it louder. Einstein is very popular. He's very popular. Yeah. Anything else? That's my mom. She's a ringer in the audience tonight. Thank you, Mom. Yeah. And just to give Google some credit, when I Googled the same thing today, because I wanted to figure out what the one in the bottom left-hand corner said, there were 2 women pictured. So I think it depends on when you type it in for Google. So I don't want to throw Google under the bus here. But this kind of gives you a sense of what a lot of people actually picture when they picture a scientist. And there's actually a test that social scientists and science education people will do, and it's called a Draw a Scientist test. They'll do it with elementary school students, and they found that they often draw something that looks very akin to Einstein. It's either the crazy hair, it's the glasses, the goggles, they're doing something dangerous. It's a rarity that they will have a woman in that picture. Or maybe you pictured something from the media. And does anyone know what show this is from? So I heard mumbles. This is from The Big Bang Theory. And take a look at this picture too, if you can see it from back there. And you'll notice that there's 4 men and 1 woman. And if you notice what the woman's doing compared to the men, what does that say to you about the woman's role in this show? I know they've expanded the show since then. I don't watch it. But that's neither here nor there. This is just an example of kind of some of the portrayals of scientists and the lack thereof with the female character here. Maybe you thought of these pictures when you pictured a scientist in your mind. And these are some prominent female scientists, or the images of them in the media. We've got Dr. Jedidah Isler, who's an astrophysicist, Dr. Sally Ride, who passed away a few years ago, an astronaut. The upper right-hand corner is Dr. Millie Dresselhaus. And there's a great GE commercial with Dr. Millie Dresselhaus, if you haven't seen it. Hedy Lamarr, if you're not familiar with, is actually an inventor. And if you Google her, she was obviously an actress as well, but she had some amazing technology that we use today in the World Wide Web. And then we have the media portrayals of Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Dorothy Vaughan, who were NASA engineers and mathematicians during the 1960s. So I think most people, I don't have to have this slide, but just so we're all on the same table, the question might come up, so what's the purpose of your research? Is there even a problem? So we're going to have some number slides, and we'll go through those really fast, but I like to preface that because there's about half the audience tonight is scientists, and they really like numbers, so I want to make sure they get their fill. So we have, US Census data says there's about 74 million children in the United States. Approximately 25% of them enroll in college. Of those, 27% of them major in science, technology, engineering, or mathematics fields. STEM is the acronym I'll use for that throughout the rest of the presentation. And of those, 50% graduate with a STEM degree. And of these graduates, about 38% are women. So you might say, that doesn't sound that bad, Roxanne. I don't know why you're wasting 10 years of your life thus far on this research. But when you break it down by discipline, you'll notice that some disciplines are doing a better job of the representation of women than others. And I know you can't see it, but the orange, 53% in 2013 is the representation of women in biology is orange. Purple is the representation in chemistry and materials science. Green is computer and math science. And then blue is engineering, and that's a 12%. They don't have, usually they combine physical sciences, which includes chemistry and physics. Physics is at about 20%, if you're wondering about that one broken down. So you can see the different disciplines have varying success, or perhaps you would argue interest for women to be interested in those fields. I'm not going to hold for this for very long, but what I want this slide to highlight is that there's actually, if you look at the STEM workforce on the left compared to the representation in the United States population, you'll notice that white males, and Asian females are overrepresented in science compared to the rest of the population, but the other demographics are actually underrepresented in STEM workforce. And if you look at the breakdown of women in each of these demographics, you'll see that women are much more underrepresented than they are in the actual US population. So why? Why? The question comes up, why is this happening? And I just Googled sexual harassment in science. Fun search. I'm sure everyone does that when they're bored at work. And these are just some of the more recent examples that have come out. I purposely didn't put names up. I'm sure some of you know them. The only name I have up there, recently, Susan J. Fowler, who was an engineer for Uber, reported about an experience she had with sexual harassment at Uber. She has since left that company. But there are a number of sexual harassment situations where professors at Caltech, UC Berkeley, have been accused of sexually harassing students. They've resigned or been fired. There's one up here that I'm going to read to you because it's blurry, but Science Magazine is one of the more popular, the AAAS advanced, I can't remember the full name. I'm sure someone will yell it out to correct me. But Science Magazine in 2015 actually had an advice column, and the female professor who was giving advice, a graduate student wrote in and said, my mentor, my major professor, is hitting on me during our interactions. What should I do? And she wrote, as long as your advisor does not move on to other advances, I suggest you put up with it with good humor if you can. Just make sure that he is listening to you and your ideas, taking in the results you are presenting, and taking your science seriously. His attention on your chest may be unwelcome, but you need his attention on your science and his best advice. She lost that job. She didn't lose her job as a scientist, but she was not allowed to give advice after this was found, and they removed it from the science website. This was 2015. Also, in that same year, a Nobel laureate jokingly said, let me tell you about my trouble with girls. 3 things happen when they are in the lab. You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry. And then we have, most recently, the Google Engineers Manifesto that was reported in the media. So you have some examples of anecdotal evidence, if you will, of some of the sexual harassment that women are experiencing within the field of science. So there's definitely an underrepresentation of women in these fields, which leads to less diversity in ideas and input. So I'd say yes, there is a problem if we have this underrepresentation. So the next question that comes up usually when I talk about what I do is, what causes this to happen? So I'm going to go back, way, way, way back in time. And again, I'm not going to go into, I'm not a history major, so I'm going to go back to the 5th century BC, but it's very brief. In Western culture, the argument is that the differentiation, the gender stereotypes that have been created go all the way back to Pythagoras, and this idea of the rational and objective was the masculine, and the emotional and subjective, the feeling, was the feminine. And since then, those differentiations have actually been used to actually assign work, to assign qualities, to kind of stereotype people into gender roles. Throughout the 16th and 19th century, women were actually not allowed to study science and engineering. They were not allowed to do many things, including sports, but they were also not allowed to do math and science because the fear was that it would impair their abilities to have children. So I don't know how this is connected to this, but in the 16th and 19th century, there was a lot of study on that. Then in the early 20th century, women were denied entry into graduate schools. And if they could get into graduate schools, they were often denied research positions after that. So they might follow a husband to a position, or in some cases, some of the prominent women who were very successful in the early 20th century, they were actually told by faculty at their institution, you can come in and do your research, but you have to do it when there's no men here, because you're going to be a distraction to them. So they would do their work at night. And then in the mid-20th century, even in the 1960s, as recently as that, there were actually job searches that were separated by gender, signifying the difference between men's and women's work. And Sally Ride, who you saw pictured earlier, actually had that. There was calls for scientists at NASA, and they were just in the men-only section. And she actually fought to get into NASA for that. So then we get into the 1970s, and we have the passage of Title IX, which you've probably heard in relation to sports, but it's actually used to make blatant discrimination illegal, so that you cannot have any exclusion or participation or be denied benefits based on sex. And it's been used most recently, starting in the 1990s, for STEM fields. Massachusetts Institute of Technology was one of the first universities to really pull their faculty together and say, we've got a problem. The women faculty there in the STEM departments pulled together, did a study, and used Title IX to try to improve the representation of women and the experience of women in those programs. And it made blatant discrimination illegal. But you might say, well, Roxanne, like, so what's the problem now? Like, that was before you were even born, so it should be fine now, right? So this is getting into what I study, which is something called STEM identity. And that's the sense of belonging within a field. We all have an identity. So if I were to ask you, like, who are you? And the first thought might be, I'm a mother, or I'm a father, or I'm a wife, I'm a husband, I'm a sister, I'm a brother, I'm a daughter. Or you might say what you do for a living. You identify with this in some way. And the way that we do this in STEM identity is we talk about your sense of belonging and your sense that you can actually succeed in this field. You have the potential and the opportunity to succeed in this. Identity, according to science education researchers, which is what I am, look at that your identity is something you kind of perform and try on. It is something you do in front of others, and then it is affected by your individual experience within school, with family and friends, and outside of school. And it's an ongoing and evolving process that depends on your own interpretation of your experiences with those individuals, how you interpret those, and then how you move on from there. So to give you a little bit of an example of this, I'm going to tell a story. We're going to say the story is about a girl named Sally. Just so you know, FYI, that's always the fake name that I throw out there. Sally Smith, if you want to know the full one for that. So let's say we have Sally. She is a twin. She's a fraternal twin. She's got a brother. She starts out, her parents provide her with all of these great toys. Building blocks, same kind of toys as her brother. But for some reason, maybe not the parents, but other people in the family support the brother more with that. They're like, wow, he's doing great with that building. He's definitely going to be an engineer. And Sally's like, oh, well, that's interesting. I'm curious. I really like to do this kind of stuff, but all right. Then she gets to school, and she experiences her classmates saying, you know, girls aren't good at science, girls aren't good at math. And she's like, well, that's weird. I think I'm pretty good at science and math, but we'll let that go. But then she also thinks about, but you know, everybody did support my brother more when he's playing with those toys than they supported me. But I'll keep going with this. Then maybe she encounters some female role models, including teachers, who say, you know, I just was never good at math. I'm just really horrible at it. And she's like, well, I really like math, and I think I'm really good at it, but these female role models in my life aren't. And I've heard that girls aren't good at math, so maybe there's some kind of connection here. But anyway, she goes on, she gets into high school, she's really psyched about having a career in some form of science, and she's talking to one of her high school teachers who she really, really respects. And he says, you know, you're doing great in advanced chemistry. What are you thinking about doing for a career? And she says, well, I think I want to be a chemistry major. And he says, I don't know if that's the right field for you. And she's like, well, why? And he's like, well, you know, I think maybe you'd be better in like psychology or like biology or medical school or something like that. And she's like, well, that's interesting. But she gets into college, in her first class, she walks in the door, and it's a class full of 100 people. And she's one of 10 women in that class. And she's like, well, that's weird, but I still think I like this course. I like what I'm doing. I think this is totally successful. I'm totally going to do this. She gets involved in lab groups. Every so often, she hears someone make a joke. I like to use quotes a lot. A joke about, you know, like she shouldn't be in science, or some kind of thing about how she should be cleaning the lab equipment as opposed to working with the lab equipment. And she's like, well, that's fine. That'll be okay. She decides, like, I want to go on to graduate school. I think that's where I want to be. And then she gets into graduate school, and she still encounters some of those same things, including like working in a lab, with some live specimens, and someone says, well, I didn't think girls like to work with live specimens because it would be too gross for them. She's like, well, that's weird, but okay. And then she continues to persevere. She ends up, one of the other graduate students asked her out on a date, and she turns him down respectfully, and he continues to ask, and then he gets violent, not to her, but he actually punches a wall in her vicinity, and she asks her department to please separate them in some capacity. And the department says, we'll get on this right away. And they don't. And she's like, okay, well, I'll change my department, but I'll finish this PhD, I'm going to finish it. And she does. And then she gets into a career, and she enters into the career, and one of the first comments she hears when she gets into that job is, well, you're only here because you're a woman. You got this job because you're a woman. And she's like, well, maybe I did. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know at this point what is real and what is not real. And she continues, but she's like, you know, I'm just feeling this chilly climate. People keep telling her, it's just a joke, just get over it. And eventually, Sally leaves, and she decides to go into some other career where she feels more welcome. So that's not, I hope that never happens to just one person, poor Sally, if that's the case. But every single one of those examples that I gave is actually an example from a research study that I have done or other researchers have done. These are real life stories. So I will put that out there too, because the daily experience with those comments does make it apparent when someone says, just let it go, they were just joking. That much more impactful when you've had that experience day in and day out. So all of those stories also revolve around this idea of a pipeline. There are transition points. Each of those points where I talked about Sally are points where we can lose potential Sallys in our pipeline. And the research that I do covers each of these different points in various ways. So the key transition points are the middle school age, but there was an article in Science magazine this year that actually looked at by the age of 5, girls and boys are actually already saying, the age of 5, they're already saying that boys are really, really smart and girls are not, when asked. Boys are really, really smart and girls are not at age 5. That blew my mind because I didn't think that that was the case. Although everyone I know that has daughters will tell me, I see a lot of heads shaking, and I think that that's partly something that is understood. Previous to that study, we had mainly thought that we see these issues, these self-confidence issues, these lack of interest issues, starting at late elementary, middle school. Then you get into high school, and the part that makes the middle school and high school so dangerous, for those of you that are scientists or STEM majors, you know that if you don't take the appropriate courses by high school, that's your pre-calc, your chemistry, your physics, it is going to take you at least a year to 2 years to catch up with that if you decide to major in college. And very few of us can afford to take on an additional 2 years of college in order to have a STEM major. But we also lose people at the college, we also lose women at the college, graduate school, and career, as you heard from the stories I gave for Sally. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but essentially middle school is that age where we're really starting to see, if you talk to individuals who study child development, middle school is really, that adolescent age is when girls and boys are trying on their identities. And you parents that have teenagers, you've probably seen it in a way that you really don't care for. You don't really care if they're trying on their identity and being empowered, you're kind of over it. But it is an age where it's really important, and it's the age where we start to see the loss of interest for girls. But when you look at there's been a lot of programs and policies that are out there that are trying to improve the access for girls in science. And what we're seeing now over the last decade, there used to be a gender gap in terms of standardized tests, course taking, GPAs, but that gender gap has closed to where it's no longer statistically significant. Which means that there's a competency level there, meaning girls are just as good at science and math as boys. What we see is their reason for leaving is they're not as interested in it. And some of the reasons for this are lack of role models, lack of relevant hands-on STEM opportunities. So those of you who remember high school science or middle school science, maybe you don't remember it at all because it didn't happen, or maybe you remember it because it was so boring, or maybe you had a great teacher and it was awesome and you had a great experience. But oftentimes, you don't have the opportunity to make it relatable to your daily life. There's also a lack of information on career options. We have a Scigirls summer camp at the MagLab, and I'm blown away every summer because I always say I wish that we had had something like this when I was in middle school, because at that time I thought the only thing available to me was medical school. I had no idea the types of research that are available and out there for people. And then you have stereotypes related to STEM professionals. Einstein's a great guy, but when 3 out of the 8 pictures for the Google search is Einstein, we have a problem. So specifically my research, and I work with a number of colleagues at the MagLab, one of whom is in the back. She's going to be very upset that I'm pointing her out, but Carrie Roberts does a lot of work with our Scigirls program. And then some colleagues who have since left, Dr. Brandon Nzekwe and Dr. Kristen Molyneux. And in those studies, we've looked at my particular interest. We do evaluation on our program, so we have pre and post surveys that measure STEM identity development in our participants. We have an all-girls Scigirls camp, and then we have a co-ed Camp Tesla. And my interest in this was because the first time as a graduate student I went to present research on Scigirls, someone came up to me right in my face and said, "What about the boys?" And I was like, whoa, I just am, you know, a 25-year-old grad student. I don't know anything about this. And I realized that there was a lot of defensiveness. In fact, as director, sometimes I field calls of people complaining about Scigirls. So I was like, well, this is interesting. This is a problem. Is an all-girls, is a single-sex environment better? Is there some benefit from that compared to a co-ed environment? And as much as I would like to say, you know, we have proven without a doubt that a single-sex environment is better than a co-ed environment, that's not, it's a lot more complicated than that. What we have seen is that girls who participate in our Scigirls, as well as girls who participate in our co-ed camp, show statistically significant increases in the STEM identity metrics that we measure. The boys don't show, they show a positive improvement, but they already come into the camp with such a high level of the competencies, the self-confidence, the self-efficacy, the STEM identity piece. They already see themselves, so we don't see as much of a change there. But what we've also found is that the structure of the activities and the role models are important. Both of these camps bring in scientists from the MagLab locally so that these students can meet them, and that is incredibly important. And the scientists often plan those activities. In fact, we have one scientist here. She might also be embarrassed that I'm going to shout out to her, but MK Haley is one of our, she is a she's a Disney Imagineer. And if you haven't heard of that, talk to one of our Scigirls, because they're now obsessed with the career, because she's that good at being a role model for those young women. So then we get into college, and what happens is from high school to college we have fewer women choosing to major in STEM. Once there though, the attrition rates are about the same. It's about 50% for men and women once in those majors. The causes for the loss of women, again, lack of role models, lack of relevant curriculum materials. One of the problems that our faculty across the nation are trying to solve is this idea of boring classes, this idea of how we can improve on a lecture-based system. And they are working at it. This is not something that they realize that this is a problem, there's a lack of interest, and there has to be a better way to get this information across. Also, lack of information on career options. You'd be surprised how many undergraduates graduate with a degree and are like, I still don't know what I can do with this degree. And then you have stereotypes related to STEM professionals. And then something, this is a buzzword that you may have heard, is the idea of stereotype threat. Claude Steele is the developer. He's a psychologist at Stanford. And this is a term that he has come up with. And it's this idea if you remind people of a stereotype that they know about a group that they belong to. For example, if you are a woman and you're taking a standardized test score and you know that the stereotype against women is that they're not good at science or math, and you're taking a quantitative test, if you're reminded of the fact that you're a woman, you might remember that stereotype and it might affect your performance. There could be some performance anxiety. And that will affect how you perform in that situation. Claude Steele has a book called Whistling Vivaldi. If you are interested in this, he does a much better job of explaining it than I do right now. But if you're interested in stereotype threat, or if you're thinking, that doesn't sound like a real thing, then definitely Whistling Vivaldi, excellent book by Claude Steele. So my work on this, and I should say that I got into the MagLab because of my interest in Scigirls, and my passion is really following those girls from that key transition point all the way through their career. But my dissertation, because it's easier to study adults than it is children, which is a good thing. You get more access with adults because they can make their own decisions. So I actually studied college students, and this original study was looking at, I interviewed a number of women, all of whom had initially majored in a STEM major. Half of them had left the major, and half of them had stayed. And this initial study really showed me that the leavers, the women who left, fell into two groups. Those who were competent, they were scoring well, they were doing well in class, but they lost interest. And this was based on, they found maybe their department unfriendly, they found another department more inclusive, more friendly for them. And then there were those who doubted their competence, but maintained interest. And doubted their competence, these are young women who were receiving C's in classes, and they saw this as a failure. And there's also studies out there that look at the level of confidence between men and women, generalizations here, but in general, men will see a C on a test and look at that and say, it's just a measure of that one test, that one day. Whereas women will look at that and say, that's my entire life, I'm horrible at this, I should never have done this in the first place, I've failed. It's taking it on you as opposed to on the situation. Then we have the stayers. They maintained interest because they found research experiences. They found meaning faculty to work with and do their research. They found mentors to walk them through the experiences. For example, if you get a C on a test and you find a mentor that tells you that's just one test, you can study more, you can do these other pieces, and you can do better at this. That can get you through. And they also found peer support networks, which were really, really crucial for them. There were a number of women who had left who thought when they got into college they didn't need to join any kind of women's group because they should just be able to do it on their own, because that's what they were supposed to do. Since that study, I've also followed some of our Scigirls into their college careers and looked at their experiences. And I had about 18 that I was able to follow from the first year of Scigirls all the way into college. And we had about 65% of them stayed into a STEM major, and the others left. And the reasons that they left the STEM major was really, most of them mentioned high school. And it was typically a high school teacher that was boring, or a high school teacher that turned them off of science, that didn't make it exciting. And they just were not sure that it was the career for them, was the experiences that we had for following our Scigirls programs. So you remember going back to that slide, you saw that there was different representations of women in different disciplines. So this led me, I work with a lot of physicists at the MagLab, and engineers. I don't want to, just highlight one group. But I worked on this with one of my graduate students, Martin Bremer, and we were really interested in what about the physics culture? How do undergraduates experience the physics culture? What is their conception? How do they define it? So this was, if you haven't caught on, most of my research is qualitative. That means I interview people, I do focus groups, I observations, all the soft, feely stuff, as one physicist has said to me, has called my research. So what we did was we interviewed the undergraduate physics majors at one university to get their conception of the culture of physics. What is it for you? And all of them said, physicists are curious, smart, committed people. And again, this is undergraduates, college students in physics. This is their first experience with the whole idea of physics. But what they also said was, arrogance is a definitive trait of physics.
Really?
And the women who left the major identified this trait as their reason for leaving. And if you're wondering, what does arrogance mean? The idea is that the concepts that they brought up were things like, physicists think they're better than all of the other majors on campus. Physicists think their major is the hardest compared to all of the others on campus. Physicists believe that if you can't make it in physics, then you really just shouldn't be in the major, and we don't need you there at all. So these are some of their definitions of arrogance that we coded for. What was really surprising, though, is that it was also this concept, I should say, the surprising piece is that the current generation of women in undergraduate physics are facing the same issues articulated by past generations. And although there isn't the explicit discrimination that happened before, there was still the underlying current. Young woman said she'd gotten an award, she'd gotten a published paper with a faculty mentor, and some of her male colleagues were saying, well, you only got that because you were a woman. Same thing as before, same thing as we heard 30 years ago. This concept of you're only getting this because everyone has to give you a leg up because you're a woman. So then when you get to graduate school and the postdoctoral phase, here we've got a point in time where men and women might be thinking about starting a family. They're making decisions about, like, not only am I like getting into my identity, but I've really, really got to get into my identity. Like, am I also going to be a mom? Am I also going to be a dad? What am I going to be with my life? And the current structure of academia and in some cases industry make it really difficult for women and men who want to start a family to succeed in their career. And there's often a lack of impetus by leadership to change these structures. If your department, let's say, is 10% women, and you're like, well, I really am not hearing the complaints that much, it's really only 10% of the population, how willing are you to do the work if you think that it's not that many people? But if you did the work, you might get more of those people in there. So it's kind of a catch-22, I guess. The causes for attrition at this stage, again, lack of role models. If you have, at this point, you're relying on faculty for your role models. And what often happens for faculty at institutions, if you are the only woman or if you're the only faculty of color, all of the students that are women or students of color rely on that one faculty member to do all of the mentoring. And they become, it's either a passion for them, or they have to say, I can't do this, and then they're judged harshly for not mentoring. So they have to decide if they want to focus on their research, and that impacts, for academia, that impacts tenure. There's also a lack of understanding about the communication when issues arise with major professors. That story I told about Sally, that's a true story that happened to a young woman in graduate school where she actually was denied a co-worker a date and he became physically violent, not against her, but in her presence. And that's, no one feels good. That's not a safe work environment. That's a hostile work environment. And her department said they would do something and they did not. It's not any university here in Tallahassee or Florida, but she left the major altogether. She did not finish her Ph.D. with that experience. And the issue becomes, another key point here for everyone, for those of you who are in academia, you might understand this, but graduate students and their mentor, graduate students and their major professor, this is a really tenuous relationship in that that graduate student is completely reliant pretty much on that mentor's passage of them, meaning their life is dependent on that major professor. That major professor does not sign off on the dissertation. They don't get a PhD, something they've spent 5 to 10 years of their life or more if they've been passionate about, astrophysics since they were 5. So it becomes really tenuous when you decide, was that a pass? Was that a quid pro quo? What just happened here? And then who do you talk to? Who do you talk to in the department? If it's a small department, most physics departments are small. Who do you talk to? Do you risk ruining that potential? And then who are your allies then if you do that? What are the policies at the university? Do you have time when you're doing research 80 hours a week to really look into what is sexual harassment and what are the policies for reporting it? So it's a really it's a difficult structure for graduate students and postdocs that are relying on those mentors. And it's a relationship that can be incredibly valuable in an apprenticeship situation, but it also can be abused. And those examples of the sexual harassment of faculty members who had done that, they had abused that process. That wasn't a one-time thing. Those faculty members were serial sexual harassers. Multiple graduate students over generations came out to talk about the experience that they had with those faculty members. So I don't have a study yet. I'm in the middle of it for graduate school, but 3 of the young women who are in my dissertation group, which was, they graduated in 2010, they agreed to let me study them indefinitely. I don't think they knew it was indefinitely, but every year they get an email from Roxanne Hughes and they're like, great, yay. And one of them went into industry right after her undergraduate. One recently got her PhD. And the third recently got her PhD and now is getting her MD, her medical degree. Preliminary data on this group is really, really depressing. They're not happy. The two who went into academia have described repeatedly having experience of implicit bias and sexism, jokes made around them, being ignored in settings, having their, and some of these might not be related to their gender, but having their work stolen in situations, having their comments taken by someone else and presented as their own. And this has impacted, for two of them, their health and their future plans in STEM. They're really considering, they're at a point, the two that had their PhD, they just got it last spring. And they were really at like a crisis situation of like, I don't really know if I want to stay here. So then we get into career. And at this point, you remember that funnel that I showed you at the beginning. And you can see that at this point, we've lost women at each of these stages. So by the time they get into a career position, we've got what social scientists and science educators hate, that pipeline metaphor, because it's really not a pipeline. You don't just like shove everything in and they all come out at the other end. We're culling it at every level. Employers struggle with dual career couples. Most women who have PhDs in science are married to a partner who has a PhD in science. Very few universities can hire two people. And this is a real difficult position. So women have to face this almost much more than men. A man might not be married to a woman in science and they can easily maybe change jobs or move positions. Women have to struggle because there's a dual career position there. Then you get into, we still have lack of role models for these career women because women in leadership, there's very few women in science leadership positions. Iris Bennett wrote a book called What Works? In that she's a Harvard Business School faculty, and she talks about getting women into leadership positions, so not just STEM, but her quote's here at the bottom, that women are in a double bind that men are not. They are perceived as either likable or competent, but not both. So women in leadership roles have to negotiate that fine line between competence and likability. And it's more difficult in some cases because the problem is, in terms of research on this, is that there are so few women in leadership positions that we actually can't do large-scale studies on this. This is mainly all interview, anecdotal, qualitative research on their experiences. So that's an interview with like Meg Whitman or something like that, or you read the book Lean In, or these kinds of pieces for this particular study. So hopefully it'll improve so we can study it and do the research. My own research on this piece was I did 3 life histories. Life histories is a fancy qualitative term for you do an interview with people about their life. You just sit with them and you ask them like, what got you interested in this? You follow their life from birth till today. And they're all faculty who are in STEM fields and they have very good careers. They're all tenured. And they got into their fields. They were in college interviewing in about the 80s and 90s. And they had stories that included one in the 80s was interviewing for a job. When she was talking to the potential employer, he came up to her and actually grabbed her butt in the 80s. And she did not stay for that interview. She actually left, but she had the ability, the economic fortitude to be able to do that. But all 3 of them mentioned when they got into their departments, the story about Sally was true for all 3 of them when they got into their departments. Any grant they received, any award they won, even their very position in the department was questioned, not by all, but by some members of that department with the comment of, you just got that because you're a woman, or even, who'd you have to sleep with to get that position? And these are, we're talking 80s, 90s in these departments. So there's something to this idea of the climate and culture within certain disciplines. There was a recent study in Science Magazine in 2017, and it interviewed faculty in 30 different disciplines, not just STEM departments, but across the spectrum. And it was faculty in the departments, national studies surveying faculty, and it asked them, I'm gonna paraphrase, but it asked them, do you think in order to be successful in your field, you have to have an innate talent or just be naturally gifted? And yes or no to that. Then it asked, do you believe that women are just as well suited or less suited for this potential giftedness or innate ability? Of those, The disciplines where members valued giftedness and innate talent, the top two were physics and philosophy. For our philosophy majors and our physicists in the room, they valued and said that in order to be successful, you had to have an innate talent, just be gifted in the subject matter. Dedication was never going to get you the success that you needed. These fields also had the lowest representation of women. And members of these fields were more likely to endorse the idea that women were less suited for scholarly level work in their field. I'm going to repeat that. And members of these fields were more likely to endorse the idea that women were less suited for scholarly level work in their field. And when I say members, I mean women and men in the field. Women and men believe that women are less suited for scholarly level work in their field. So, before I go into some more positive pieces, I'm going to read a quote that really spoke to me recently because of the work that we do at the MagLab with inspiring girls and my own work with empowering girls in science. This was an engineer who was interviewed, and she said, "The juxtaposition of the support I received to pursue STEM education against the lack of support out in industry was sharp and harsh. I felt let down by the education system for its positive portrayal of the engineering field to inspire females into the career, against its failure to paint a correspondingly realistic picture of the real-world challenges that women face in the STEM workplace." She had left engineering, and she felt that there had been a disservice for her in these fields. So, what can we do? Let's get to some positive. You're like, wow, Roxanne, I wasn't expecting to cry over my beer or wine tonight. So this is key. The research on getting more women into these fields is twofold. We need to improve the climate of STEM disciplines so that women and other marginalized groups feel that they can succeed. And then we need to prepare these marginalized groups. Because we're not going to change the climate overnight, we also need to prepare these groups for what they're going to experience and the setbacks and biases that they will encounter. We need to equip them with ways to address that when they encounter it. So for the people in the room, these were the audiences that I envisioned being in the room. And those are our parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc. What can you do right now, like when you go home to children tonight? You can feed children's interest. There are a number of toys, tools that are available out you. In the upper right-hand corner, I have a video for Goldie Blocks. Goldie Blocks is a toy company designed by a female engineer to inspire girls into engineering. It doesn't mean that boys can't play with it as well. It just means that when you would go before Goldie Blocks, when you would go and look at toys for engineers, they were mainly in the boys section. We still segregate boys and girls section in the toy store. That's another story, not my field. I won't get on that soapbox for you guys. But their goal is to get more girls into the engineering fields. There's also, PBS is a really great supporter of girls and science. And Scigirls is a national organization. They have a website where they actually have videos and games and role models for girls to watch. So also, as parents, grandparents, or just people that talk to any of these individuals, recognize and stop friends or family who stereotype children into gendered roles. So if it is Uncle Stu who says to your niece or nephew, well, I mean, should she really be playing with that truck? Like, is engineering really the field for her? Like, shouldn't she be playing with a doll? Maybe you can say, she can play with whatever she wants, or call out, like, that's stereotyping, that's pigeonholing her into this. But most people don't realize they're even doing it. So to do it in a way of kind of making sure they're part of the conversation. And then a piece that I have not mentioned yet, Carol Dweck is this book in the right-hand corner. Carol Dweck is a psychologist who has a book called Mindset. And this mindset book is really focused on this idea of growth versus fixed. So people who believe that you're just born naturally gifted at math, maybe some people are, but it's a very small portion of the population. That's the fixed mindset, and that prevents people from seeing an ability. That means a person with a fixed mindset is going to get a C on a test and say, well, I'm clearly not good at this, so I either have it or I don't, and I don't have it, so they leave. But what Carol is arguing is that you need to teach people the growth mindset. You need to teach them that there are opportunities if you work hard at it. Very few people also came out of the womb and could play the piano, but they learned and they practiced, and it's the same with math. You rarely hear anyone in our society say, reading was just too hard for me, so I stopped doing it. But we do that for math. You hear people say that. So this idea of teaching grown-ups and children that if you work harder at it, and working harder at it isn't, hitting the book on your head. Working harder is finding ways and tools and things that will help you to improve in those pieces. So for teachers, what can teachers do? Introduce students to relevant role models. And there are a ton of online options for this. FabFems is at the bottom. And then I have a number of, the MagLab also has access to videos. Some of our scientists are in the room that are in those videos where you can actually have, and our scientists will come out to your classrooms. They're very friendly. They work well with others. So. But you can actually reach out and get those scientists, or you can show videos to show different types of scientists. That doesn't mean like just women. That means different personalities, different types of careers, people doing different things. Something other than the goggles, the crazy hair, the lab coat. There's also ways to make science more relevant. And we have CPALMS is locally based, but they actually connect videos to make the science relevant to our local area as well as Florida. And we also have lesson plans on our MagLab website as well that advocate and make the science more relevant. And again, teachers can promote that growth mindset over the fixed mindset. And finally, scientists. We have a lot of them in the room, and the main thing is to be a role model. Communicate your science to various audiences. The MagLab, if you are not familiar, has an annual open house. Kristen, who introduced me, runs that. It is a huge endeavor that requires herding a lot of cats and scientists. But it's a really great opportunity because people come in who have never been to the MagLab before and they get excited about it. And that's one way of communicating. Another is mentoring students, tutoring students. Another is going into classrooms. And then same thing as with the parents and teachers. Stop others from stereotyping. When you hear a stereotype, you say it. You call it out. You say, that's a stereotype. That's not every. That's a generalization. That's not every experience. And also promoting the growth mindset over the fixed mindset. I don't think I've ever heard at the MagLab a scientist say, I was just always good at math. I was just born good at math. I've rarely heard that. Most of them have said at some point there was a setback and I had to work at it and figure it out. And children and high school students and college students need to hear that. So that's another way of being a role model for scientists. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.